All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to talk about something pretty fascinating, and honestly, something that's often completely misunderstood. What's really going on inside the psychology of female attraction.
So let's start with the big one. What do you think really defines female desire? For centuries, our culture has handed us a pretty straightforward script, right? But what if that script is, well, wrong? What if there's a whole other story, something way deeper and more complex that's just waiting to be told?
And this is where we see a huge disconnect. On one side, you've got the societal view, the whole sugar and spice thing, where women are seen as gentle, pure, and simple. But the material we're looking at today suggests there's this hidden reality, a side that's, well, darker, way more complex, and maybe even a little drawn to things that are considered taboo.
That brings us to a core idea for this entire discussion, the split between the public self and the private self. So let's break down what these two different personas are really all about.
Okay, so the public persona. That's the version of ourselves we show everyone else. It's polished, it's polite, it's what's socially acceptable. But the private persona, that's where things get really interesting. This is the unfiltered you, the one driven by fantasy, where all those deep, hidden desires live.
And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? External behavior rarely predicts internal fantasies. It's basically saying that what you see on the outside, well, it's probably not the whole story. The person someone shows the world can be a universe away from who they are on the inside.
So, how does this whole split persona thing actually play out? Well, let's take a look at a classic powerful archetype, Beauty and the Beast. But trust me, we're going to look at it in a way you've probably never thought of before.
We're all taught that this fairy tale is about Belle's compassion and her kindness. But the theory we're digging into today, it throws that idea right out the window. It's a completely different and frankly more radical interpretation.
The argument is that Belle isn't just putting up with the beast. No, she's actually attracted to him. Attracted to his raw power, his wild, untamable, even monstrous nature. It's the very danger he represents that makes him so magnetic.
And this brings up a really fascinating idea called emotional conquest. The thinking here is that the real thrill for Belle isn't just about finding her Prince Charming. No, the powerful psychological pull is the challenge of taming the beast. It's about transforming the monster. But here's the kicker. What happens after she wins? What happens after the conquest is over? Once the beast turns into a tame, predictable prince, this theory suggests that the spark, that initial intense attraction, can actually just fizzle out. Why? Because the challenge that made it so exciting is gone.
Now, this whole beast archetype isn't just stuck in some old fairy tale book. Oh no, it is alive and kicking in the pop culture that we see all around us every single day.
I mean, just look at the evidence. Paranormal romance novels, right? They dominate the bestseller lists. And who are the male leads? They're vampires, werewolves, basically monsters. These guys are the modern-day beasts. They've got the danger, the power, the unpredictability that seems to resonate so deeply with so many readers.
Okay, but this isn't just about books and movies. Let's switch gears and look at some hard data. I'm going to throw a number at you, 40%. What do you think that number represents? Just take a second and think about it.
All right, got a guess? That 40%, that's the percentage of pornography users who are now women. Let that sink in for a second. This is a huge, massive shift. It shows this incredible rise in women actively exploring their desires in a space that, for a long time, was pretty much seen as a guys-only club.
And this is where things get even more complex. And it all ties back to that private self we were talking about. The data shows that female viewers are often drawn to content that involves themes of, say, domination. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That seems to fly in the face of modern ideas about female empowerment, right? But what our source suggests is that this isn't a contradiction. Instead, it might be reflecting these deeply suppressed desires, a really powerful, hidden part of the psyche.
Okay, so we've talked about fairy tales, we've looked at data. What does this all mean for us? What's the big takeaway when it comes to understanding attraction in the real world? Here's the most important thing to get. Those private fantasies, the deeper, maybe even darker ones, they don't just vanish because society tells us they should. They're a fundamental part of our psychology. They don't get erased, they just get pushed down, repressed. So, with all that in mind, what can we take away from this? Well, there are 3 big things. Number 1, recognize that attraction is way more complex and subconscious than we often think. Number 2,
Understand that being a little beastly, having that power and unpredictability, can be just as attractive, if not more so, than being conventionally handsome. And finally, number 3, it might be time to completely rethink the whole idea of leagues. Attraction goes so much deeper than just what's on the surface.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If attraction really operates on these deep, subconscious levels, driven by ancient archetypes and desires we don't even always admit to ourselves, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What else are we completely missing about who we are?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are here once again to take your source material and really just break it down for you.
Get right into the weeds.
Exactly. We want to hand you those key insights so you can feel, instantly and thoroughly informed. But today is different.
Very different.
We're not talking market trends, not historical events. We are going straight into the deep, often messy waters of the human psyche.
And specifically, we're challenging a really, really persistent narrative.
Right, the polite narrative surrounding, half the world's population.
We're talking about that dissonance, the gap between how society expects women to present themselves.
The sugar and spice.
Exactly, that long-standing cultural ideal of gentleness, of purity, emotional simplicity, and the complex, powerful, and sometimes, let's just say, taboo reality of their inner psychological world.
The hidden architecture of female desire.
That's the perfect phrase for it.
Yeah.
We're moving beyond that two-dimensional stereotype.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. This deep dive is anchored in the work of the contemporary cultural psychologist and critic Taban.
Right.
And his work, which synthesizes behavioral data, literary analysis, all these different psychological models, it makes a really provocative central claim.
I'd say so. The core of it is that the widely held societal image of the inherently pure and gentle woman is, psychologically speaking, a facade.
A facade. That's a strong word.
It is, but Taban asserts that women's deepest desires, their private fantasies, are every bit as complex and driven by these forces of power and tension and potentially taboo things as men's are.
And maybe even more so.
Well, that's his argument. He suggests that because society enforces such rigid behavioral standards on women, these more primal desires get forced into a deeper state of repression.
Oh, they don't just go away.
No, they intensify. They can potentially become even more layered, more intense than what men might experience more openly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, listening to this right now? Why is this deep dive into what Taban calls the duality model so essential? We're not just, gossiping about secret cravings here.
No, not at all. This matters because attraction, identity, the dynamics of our relationships, they are all fundamentally shaped by these repressed forces.
It's what's happening under the surface.
Exactly. This deep dive is kind of a shortcut to understanding that often the most powerful psychological drivers are the ones that are actively hidden from public view.
So we're giving you the tools to look past the superficial assumptions.
And to really understand the profound psychological conflict that shapes modern attraction, our mission today is to analyze Taban's framework, ground it in cultural evidence and some hard data, and then figure out what it all means for how we define desire and partnership.
All right, let's get into it. The foundation of this whole theory, Taban calls it the dual personality model.
And it really is the conceptual bedrock for everything else we're going to talk about.
It asserts that every woman embodies not just, different moods, but two entirely distinct operating systems.
Yes, two systems designed to manage the world. And they are separate entities built for completely separate purposes.
And they have to stay separate.
That's the key. Their primary relationship is one of necessary active separation. They exist in a state of what you could call carefully managed cognitive dissonance.
Let's define the first one then. Persona 1, the public persona. Tell us what this identity is designed to do, how it operates.
Okay, so the public persona is the meticulously crafted one. It's the polished, social, professional face you show the world.
The one you meet at a job interview.
Exactly, or your colleague in a meeting, or the stranger on the street. It's the identity dictated by societal norms, and its core function is survival and success in a structured world.
So it's rational.
Very rational. It's risk-averse. It prioritizes long-term stability, reputation, social acceptance. It's the gatekeeper persona.
So it's basically the CEO of your external life. Its job is to constantly optimize for appropriateness, for safety.
Right. It filters all communication and all behavior to make sure it aligns with that strict code of conduct society imposes on women.
A code that historically and even now, demands much higher standards of, say, purity and emotional control than those applied to men.
Precisely. And we have to acknowledge the immense psychological labor that requires. Maintaining this persona isn't effortless.
Yeah.
It's a constant, high-energy cognitive process. Think of it like a firewall that has to be continuously updated and monitored.
And the success of this public persona is judged by its ability to manage and suppress any impulse that could rock the boat.
Any impulse that could lead to social or professional instability, this need for constant control is so critical because it's what explains the flip side.
The other persona, the hidden identity, persona 2, the private persona.
Mm-hmm.
Tatum describes it not just as the subconscious, but as the uninhibited, complex, sometimes raw psychological core.
And it only emerges in contexts of absolute safety,
Yeah.
or deep intimacy, or, and this is the most commonplace, in the realm of pure fantasy.
This is what he calls the beast within.
Yes, it's the repository of what we could call unfiltered human nature. The private persona is defined by the absence of inhibition.
It just doesn't care about the rules.
It completely rejects the public persona's concerns about consequences or judgment or social acceptability. It's the psychological container for desires that might involve deep submission, extreme power dynamics, raw emotional intensity.
And things that would be considered taboo or even dangerous in the real world.
Exactly. The structured real world that the public persona has to navigate so carefully.
So the main takeaway here, the absolute core of Taben's duality, is that these two personas aren't just distinct. They have to remain deliberately separate,
They must.
which means the public persona's appropriate controlled behavior is a fundamentally poor predictor of what's going on inside.
Poor, if not outright misleading. It's the mechanism of repression in action. If we assume that, say, independence and professionalism in the workplace means an equivalent desire for total control in the bedroom, we fundamentally misunderstand the psychological necessity of this duality.
So the one creates the other.
In a way, yes. The desires housed in the private persona are so intense, precisely because they are denied expression in public life. The public persona acts like a psychological pressure cooker,
Forcing all that primal stuff underground.
forcing it into the secure, sealed-off realm of fantasy. The desires don't disappear, they intensify.
I have to pause there because that is a really hard claim to just accept. I mean, the immediate counter-argument is, isn't this duality just a reflection of internalized societal pressure? Or maybe just a normal spectrum of human thought?
That's a fair question.
Why does Taben elevate it to this fundamental, separate psychological structure?
Caben's argument is that the rigidity of the separation is what defines it as a duality. It's not just having different moods. The public persona is so fundamentally built on the exclusion of the private persona's contents that it operates as a psychological defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism against what?
Against the immense societal penalty for public expression of these taboo desires. Think about it. The cost of a woman expressing these things openly can be catastrophic to her reputation, her career.
So the public persona has to be relentlessly vigilant.
Exactly. It's the sheer cost of self-management that makes the private persona crave the opposite, a safe space to let go completely. We're not talking about minor disagreements in preference, like enjoying different kinds of movies. We're talking about an essential active conflict between what you need to do for social success and what your primal desire demands.
That sets the stage perfectly for our next section, where we look at how this duality plays out in a classic story. We're moving to section 2, the Beauty and the Beast archetype.
Ah, yes, a story that has resonated across centuries, across cultures, and Taben argues it's basically a foundational template for understanding a core element of feminine desire.
Which is?
The profound and often irresistible attraction to raw, untamable power and danger. It's the narrative engine for what he calls the emotional conquest.
Okay, so conventionally, if you ask most people what the moral of Beauty and the Beast is, what do they say?
They'll say it's a sweet story about compassion, about looking past appearances to see the inner goodness. That kindness wins the day.
It's a lesson in not judging a book by its cover.
Right. But Taben challenges that interpretation completely, head on.
How so?
He asserts that this conventional reading entirely misses the psychological depth. He claims Belle's initial fundamental fascination, the spark that keeps her from fleeing the castle instantly, it doesn't stem primarily from compassion.
It comes from something else.
It comes from the attraction to the beast's raw, unchecked power, his dominance, his perceived monstrosity.
So it's not about the good man inside the monster.
Not at first. It's about the monster itself. The beast is the ultimate symbol of masculinity untamed by the social contract. He is intense, unpredictable, formidable. He operates outside the rules.
So the attraction isn't to the eventual prince, it's to the current beast. It's an attraction to this overwhelming force that polite society can't contain.
Yes. And this reinterpretation, it really challenges that whole looking past appearances idea.
Well, how does it stand up to it? Because that idea is central to the traditional story.
It shifts the focus. It moves it from a moral judgment to a psychological tension. The conventional reading is all about virtue.
Doing the right thing, being kind.
Taban's reading is about challenge. The monstrous nature of the beast provides a barrier of pure, unadulterated power. A mere, handsome, polite prince is, well, he's accessible, he's predictable.
He offers no high-stakes project.
Exactly. The beast, by contrast, offers maximum tension. He is dangerous, perhaps even lethal, and he is deeply resistant to emotional connection. That initial tension is the psychological magnet, because it provides the ultimate potential reward.
And this leads us to a really critical distinction Taban draws. Emotional conquest versus sexual conquest.
Right. He posits that the core feminine psychological drive, which is reflected in this archetype, is the act of taming the beast. But we have to be very specific about what taming means here.
It's not about breaking his spirit.
No. Taming in this context does not mean domestication into a docile pet. It's not about demanding physical submission. It is about achieving a unique, total influence over his emotional core.
Okay, explain that.
The goal is to win the beast's absolute, unwavering emotional fidelity and devotion, and this is key, while retaining the potential for his raw power. The beast must remain formidable to the outside world.
But be uniquely tender and devoted to her, and only her.
Precisely. The victory isn't just about physical attraction. It's the achievement of being the one person on Earth who can wield influence over this immensely powerful, previously resistant entity.
So this act of emotional conquest, Taban argues, is the psychological equivalent of men's historical drive for, say, sexual conquest.
Exactly. The public persona, remember, seeks stability. But the private persona craves the affirmation of unique power.
And what's more powerful than taming the untamable?
Right. To demonstrate the emotional skill and the psychological depth necessary to transform a powerful monster into a devoted guardian, that is a profound affirmation of self-worth. It's a conquest that validates her identity in a way that no amount of surface-level flattery ever could.
The beast chooses her not because she's pretty,
but because her unique emotional power is strong enough to pierce his defenses. It's a testament to her strength, not just his.
This high-stakes psychological project makes complete sense, especially in the context of the private persona seeking intensity. But then we hit the paradox, and it's, frankly, a bit unsettling.
It is. It's the fading attraction.
What happens when the woman successfully achieves this emotional conquest? When the beast fully transforms into the predictable, handsome, fully domesticated prince?
Taban argues the attraction may fade significantly.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Why? Why does it fade?
Because the mechanism that fueled the attraction in the first place, the tension, the danger, the unpredictability, is gone.
The challenge is over.
The challenge is over. The private persona was drawn to that constant high-stakes project of dealing with his untamed nature. Once the beast is predictable, once the monstrosity is fully integrated into the safe, structured world of the public persona,
the passion drains out.
The intensity that was the specific source of that passion is gone. The relationship shifts from this compelling, high-stakes project to comfortable domestic stability. And for the private persona, comfort can equal boredom.
So the very success of the conquest fundamentally undermines the desire that started it all.
It seems that way. The relationship becomes safe and secure, which is what the public persona requires for survival and long-term planning. But that very safety starves the private persona of the intensity and tension it thrives on.
It's a catch-22.
It really is. And it raises a profound question. Is the deepest, most intense desire fundamentally incompatible with long-term peace?
Wow.
Taban suggests that the desire is less for the partner as a stable individual and more for the experience of the conquest and the power implied by that transformation.
So once the transformation is permanent,
the psychological reward system shuts down. The private persona requires the presence of that latent, dangerous potential to sustain that high-level psychological engagement. Without the beast, there's just a man who happens to be a prince.
let's pivot now. We're moving from these ancient archetypes to some hard, modern data. Because if Taban's model holds up, We should see these repressed desires manifesting in a huge way in the content people consume privately.
Absolutely. This brings us to section 3, cultural evidence in erotic literature.
And this is where the numbers are just staggering. We are talking about the dominance of romance.
It's not just a popular niche, the romance genre is a cultural giant. The data consistently shows that romance novels, and particularly those focused on fantasy, paranormal themes, or dark romance, they just dominate bestseller lists.
They drive a massive portion of the entire publishing industry's revenue.
It's a clear economic indicator of the private persona's preferred escape, where it goes when it wants to be fed.
And crucially, the leads in these top-selling books are almost never the gentle, predictable characters that the public persona would approve of.
Almost never. They are the desirable, monstrous male lead.
Literally or figuratively beasts.
Absolutely. The protagonists are often vampires, alpha werewolves, controlling billionaire CEOs, mafia bosses, you name it. Other anti-heroes defined by their separation from law and social convention.
They embody the exact traits that Tabin says appeal to the private persona.
The list is clear. Danger, overwhelming strength, and absolute unpredictability.
Okay, let's analyze that trifecta in detail. Why is that specific mix so potent?
Well, strength signifies competence and security on a very foundational, primal level. It's the ability to shield against external threats.
The pernectar.
Yes. Then danger signifies high stakes and intensity. The relationship itself becomes a kind of psychological battlefield, which provides the tension the private persona craves.
And unpredictability.
That is the hallmark of the untamed. It means he is not operating under the rules of society or even the heroine's expectations. It makes him a true challenge for that emotional conquest we talked about.
So this combination offers a fantasy partner who is simultaneously terrifying.
And trustworthy, but only to her. He's a monster to the world, but a guardian to her.
So the narrative, the book, provides a controlled environment to engage with chaos. The woman gets the thrill of the dangerous relationship.
Without any of the real-world consequences. No instability, no abandonment, no actual physical harm. It's psychological exploration by proxy. It's a safe space to play with fire.
And when you look at the tropes that are just everywhere in these genres.
Oh, they all point to the same thing. The fated mate, forced proximity, the initial high conflict resistance from the hero who claims he doesn't do relationships or isn't good for her.
Only for the heroine to slowly, skillfully dismantle his emotional fortress.
Exactly. The narrative climax is almost always the beast's absolute, total surrender of his heart, not just his body. She has brought a massive, destructive force to heal, using only her emotional depth and resilience.
That is a true conquest.
That is the fantasy.
Now, T-Bon uses some pretty extreme examples to show just how deep and complex these hidden psychological fascinations go. It's not just gothic romance.
No, the spectrum is wide.
And we have to discuss his use of titles like Morning Glory Milking Farm in this context.
We do, and we have to approach this impartially, focusing on what this kind of extreme content signifies psychologically. The content itself is secondary to what its popularity tells us.
So the fact that a novel involving interspecies dynamics and very unconventional submission themes can achieve significant commercial success, even if it's way outside the mainstream.
That fact is evidence. It demonstrates that the private persona is willing to engage with themes that are utterly forbidden, completely unrealistic, and far, far outside the bounds of the public persona's reality.
And it does that purely for the psychological exploration they offer.
It's proof that these aren't just minor preferences. They are deep, often what society would call deviant psychological urges that demand some form of expression. The content serves as a psychological mirror for what's being repressed.
The more outlandish the scenario, the safer it is.
I think so. The more outlandish the scenario, the safer it is to engage with the underlying psychological urge. The content reflects a suppressed need for scenarios involving extreme control dynamics or vulnerability or a total surrender of agency.
So it confirms Tabin's crucial point.
It does. The complexity and the darkness of inner feminine desire is a fact, and its true nature can only really be measured by looking at the content consumed when the public persona is safely off duty.
Okay. We've used archetype and we've used literary consumption data. Now let's ground this whole discussion in Section 4 with even more concrete modern behavioral metrics.
We're really hard numbers, right?
Right. Modern data on pornography consumption. This is where the clash between public ideals and private behavior becomes the most stark.
It's a recent and massive behavioral shift that directly challenges that idealized image of the modern independent woman.
And Tabin highlights a really striking data point.
The fact that women's consumption of pornography is rising dramatically, it now accounts for nearly 40% of all users across major platforms.
40%. That's not a fringe group.
Not at all. And this isn't just casual viewing. This is active, deliberate consumption that is being driven by the private persona.
Let's put that figure in perspective. 40% represents tens of millions of users actively seeking and engaging with this content behind closed doors, often using private browsing modes specifically to bypass the scrutiny of the public persona.
Exactly. It's a deliberate act of private exploration.
So what does the preference analysis reveal? What kind of content is being consumed?
This is the crucial part. The data reveals a strong inclination toward content involving power exchange, domination, and critically explicit submission.
So women are significantly more likely to engage with themes that involve
Scenarios where their agency is temporarily, or in some cases, totally relinquished to a dominant figure.
Okay, wait, let's stop there and introduce the critical challenge here. Because if the modern mandate, the public persona's primary mission, is uncompromising empowerment, independence, and agency,
It is.
then why does the private persona crave profound submission? Isn't that just a complete psychological regression? It feels like a total contradiction.
That is the crucial question. And Tabanon argues it is precisely because of the societal mandate for empowerment that the submission fantasy is so strong.
The one creates the need for the other.
Yes. The public persona's need for constant control, for independence, for rationality, for self-management, it's psychologically exhausting.
The burden of constant vigilance.
Exactly. The submission fantasy offers a controlled, safe, temporary escape from that immense managerial burden.
So it's the ultimate psychological vacation.
That's a great way to put it. It's a vacation from having to be the polished, responsible, appropriate public persona every single minute of every single day. It's a moment where control is willingly and safely ceded to someone else.
In the fantasy, then, the full weight of responsibility is lifted.
It's placed entirely on the shoulders of the partner, the beast figure, and this provides a profound psychological release, a desired vulnerability that the public persona would never, ever risk in the real world.
So the intensity of the domination content, it's less about the technical mechanics of it.
And more about the total surrender of agency. It reflects that deeply suppressed need for psychological rest from the burden of being in charge.
This dichotomy is maybe the clearest empirical evidence we have for the duality model.
I would agree. The public persona fights for political and social control, while the private persona finds deep psychological relief in the fantasy of surrendering it.
And this discrepancy, it explains why the data is so shocking to some people.
It does, because you can be a fierce, successful CEO advocating for total independence in every aspect of your public life,
While simultaneously craving scenarios in the privacy of your own mind that involve a temporary, safe loss of control.
The conflict exists because the public persona is a necessary adaptation to social reality, but the private persona reflects an unfiltered, primal human need for both intensity and respite from the burdens of self-determination.
Okay, let's move into our final section, Section 5. Let's synthesize these observations and move toward Tabon's surprisingly practical and useful advice.
Especially advice regarding attraction, particularly for those who feel they don't fit the conventional ideals.
Right. So what's the primary psychological conclusion we have to reiterate here?
It's this. These desires for power, for danger, for emotional conquest, or for submission, they are not eradicated by social pressure, not by feminism, not by modern ideals. They are simply repressed,
Driven underground.
where they fuel cultural consumption and private fantasies. Repression acts as an amplifier. It doesn't eliminate the desire, it just makes it more potent in private.
And this realization, it fundamentally changes the criteria for attraction.
It has to.
It leads to Tabon's specific and very counterintuitive message for men. Attraction is not always or even primarily tied to conventional good looks, a perfect appearance, or superficial charm.
Men are so often taught to prioritize the visible markers of success, a chiseled jaw, a big bank account, a stylish wardrobe. But Tabon argues for a complete reevaluation of what constitutes attractive power.
He talks about the power of being beastly.
Yes, the manifestation of psychological strength, of potential danger, and that untamable quality. He argues that can be just as powerful, if not more so, in fostering intense attraction than being traditionally handsome or conventionally successful.
Okay, we need to clarify what that means. In a real-world, non-fantasy context, we're not advising men to literally start growling or have a terrible temper.
Of course not, no.
So what are the real-world behavioral traits that embody this beastly power?
We are talking about psychological levers. Things like an absolute confidence that doesn't seek external validation, an intensity in your purpose, a palpable aura of self-contained power.
An unwillingness to be constrained by social expectations or the approval of others.
Exactly. These qualities signal that raw, unconstrained, formidable nature that appeals directly to the private persona. This kind of power promises that high-stakes conquest we keep coming back to.
It satisfies that deep, latent desire for unique emotional influence over something magnificent and formidable.
So it suggests that when the public persona is interacting with someone, she's assessing a certain set of traditional criteria. Stability, compatibility, safety. This is a good long-term bet.
But when the private persona is observing,
She is looking for the beast, the challenge, the intensity, the potential for that ultimate emotional conquest.
and because these two sets of criteria are so incredibly distinct, someone who scores low on the public persona's metrics, maybe they lack conventional handsomeness or wealth.
They can score extremely high on the private persona's metrics if they embody that powerful, untamed energy. The psychological criteria are just radically different from the compatibility criteria you'd find on a checklist.
So the ultimate take-home message from Taban, then, is practical, it's direct, and it's surprisingly encouraging for anyone who feels they don't fit that mold of an idealized Prince Charming.
His closing advice is based entirely on this duality model. Do not assume any woman is out of your league based purely on superficial appearance or traditional measures of success alone.
And the justification for that hinges on the fact that if a woman is seeking the thrill of taming a powerful, potentially dangerous force, the beast, that force can be packaged in any external container.
The psychological power, the untamed energy, that is the attractor, not necessarily the aesthetic container it comes in. Understanding this duality means understanding that the criteria for intense private attraction are complex. They're driven by these deep psychological needs, and they are often totally disconnected from the criteria for public, stable relationship formation.
The challenge is the fuel, the stability is the constraint.
A perfect summary.
This has been a fascinating, demanding, and frankly a challenging deep dive into the raw psychology of desire. Let's do a quick synthesis of the major points for the listener.
Okay. We first established Taban's fundamental framework, that necessary active separation between the polished public persona, which seeks safety and stability,
And the uninhibited private persona, which craves intensity and taboo release. And we demonstrated that external behavior is a fundamentally unreliable metric for internal desire.
Then we dissected the Beauty and the Beast archetype. We redefined Belle's attraction not as charity, but as a psychological pull toward raw, untamed power.
Initiating that high-stakes game of emotional conquest, and the inherent paradox being that success taming the beast often undermines the very passion it created.
From there, we connected this powerful archetype to modern behavioral evidence. We noted the overwhelming dominance of romance fiction featuring dangerous, unpredictable leads.
Demonstrating how the fantasy market serves as a psychological outlet for these repressed desires, even extending to content that is way outside the mainstream.
And finally, we hit the hard data. The dramatic rise in women's consumption of pornography, particularly content involving domination and submission.
Underscoring that stark clash between the external push for empowerment, the public persona's mandate, and the internal desire for temporary surrender, the private persona's psychological relief from the burden of constant self-control.
If we connect all this back to the bigger picture, Taban's work really illuminates the ongoing essential tension that defines modern life. The conflict between social ideals, what we know we must be to succeed in the world, and the primal, complex nature of human desire, what the repressed self often secretly craves. Society enforces the structure, but in doing so, it inadvertently fuels the intensity of the suppressed desire.
That structural tension leads us right back to the paradox of attraction. If intense desire thrives on the untamed nature of the beast, and taming the beast is the goal of the emotional conquest, then what happens when the conquest is complete?
Right.
It makes you wonder about the long game in relationships. If desire thrives on tension and distance, what does that imply about the long-term sustainability of relationships built on that initial beastly power versus, comfortable, necessary domestic stability? Is desire fundamentally incompatible with peace and security?
That is the lingering question, isn't it? The public persona chooses security. The private persona chooses intensity. When one is prioritized, the other is starved. It demands that every listener consider the cost of maintaining either position for too long.
A deeply complex thought to end on. But let me leave you with one final question to consider on your own, building on Tabin's idea of repression. If the public persona is constantly fighting to maintain an image of virtue and control and rationality, what specific desire do you think stands out as the most repressed in our contemporary context? The one that will inevitably explode in future cultural output? Think about it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are confronting one of the most provocative psychological assertions in our source material, and that is the hidden complexity of women's desire. We're really being forced to look beyond the surface, the whole sugar and spice societal narrative of female purity, and explore the claim that women's inner lives harbor these complex, dark, and often taboo desires.
Right, and this forces us to reckon with what Tabin calls the duality of female personality. You have the polished, compliant public persona, which is, it's designed for social acceptance. And then you have the uninhibited, sometimes primal private persona. And the crucial point here is that external behavior is a profoundly unreliable predictor of what's going on internally.
Exactly. And that inner life is really where our debate takes root today. The central disagreement is, it's how we interpret the evidence of this private persona. Specifically, this strong attraction to the dangerous, sort of beastly male archetype and the documented consumption of domination-based content. So does all of this evidence point toward a fundamental, repressed desire for submission? Or does it primarily represent a desire for emotional conquest and a fascination with raw power? I'm going to argue that the sheer force and nature of these preferences indicate a suppressed need for deep submission.
And I'm coming in from a different angle. While I fully acknowledge the pull toward the dark and the unpredictable, I contend that interpreting this fascination as a desire for submission just fundamentally misreads the psychological mechanism at work. I think the evidence is much better understood as a demonstration of agency, rooted in the desire to exert emotional power and to achieve a profound conquest over the untamable.
Position statements. Okay, so my core claim is that the consistent, documented popularity of these beastly archetypes and the hard consumption data, it all reflects fundamentally suppressed desires for deep submission that are psychologically very real. This isn't just about harmless narrative fantasy. This is about an engine of desire running just beneath the surface. And to support this, we just have to look at the data. Women's consumption of pornography is rising dramatically. It's now close to 40% of all users, and crucially, they exhibit a greater likelihood to specifically engage with violent or domination-based content. This statistical preference for material that is centered on submission, it stands in direct, stark contrast to modern ideals of female empowerment and agency.
Mm-hmm.
And that contradiction is the key. Why, if the public ideal is total empowerment, does the private fantasy so often gravitate toward relinquishing control? The existence of this clash, I think, proves the desire is repressed. It is a taboo fascination that's channeled into the safety of the private persona, affirming that the underlying interest is submission, the safe, temporary, and desired relinquishing of control to a powerful force.
That statistical data is undeniable, I'll grant you that, but the interpretation of it requires, I think, a lot of nuance. I agree that women are powerfully drawn to the untamable, the man who embodies raw strength and unpredictability. However, the psychological center of gravity is agency, not passivity. The key example Tabin uses is the Beauty and the Beast archetype. Belle is drawn to the beast's monstrous power, yes, but the fundamental requirement for the romantic payoff is the successful taming of that raw power. Tabin clearly defines this as emotional conquest, the feminine equivalent of men's sexual conquest. The attraction is really to the magnitude of the challenge. The size of the beast's internal chaos is the measure of the feminine subject's power to domesticate it. And the evidence supporting my view is that this attraction, as it's noted in the material, it tends to fade once the man is successfully domesticated. If the central drive were submission, the man's tamed, domesticated state would be irrelevant, or maybe even preferable. The fact that the challenge has to remain suggests the psychological engine is the pursuit and maintenance of power, not the passive desire to be subjected to it. Core debate. So I want to challenge that premise that attraction to danger automatically equates to a desire for submission. I mean, the core issue for me remains the fading of attraction. If the desire were for true submission, the relationship would achieve stability once the power differential was established and the woman was safely subject to the man's power. But we see the opposite happen. The attraction diminishes precisely when the man becomes predictable and safe. This strongly indicates that the initial drive was the conquest of the unpredictable element, not the stability of being overpowered. The thrill is in the engagement with the raw force, an engagement that ultimately asserts feminine control.
But you're focusing too heavily on the resolution of the narrative. I think the initial psychological impetus is far more revealing. We have to look at that moment of initial visceral attraction. The enduring appeal of the monstrous lead, vampires, werewolves, the emotionally volatile alphas, is the raw power, the strength, and the unpredictable darkness they embody. Tabin emphasizes that being beastly is as powerful an attractor as being conventionally handsome, precisely because it operates on a deeper, more primal level. So even if the story ends in taming, the energy that fuels the entire relationship is the recognition of an overwhelming, subjugating force. This initial intense draw to strength itself, irrespective of how the heroine later converts that strength, reinforces the idea that the core, repressed interest is the attraction to a force that demands submission.
But doesn't the pursuit of that raw, untamed force itself demonstrate agency? She is choosing the highest risk target. She isn't passively waiting to be submitted. She's actively seeking out the greatest emotional challenge possible. The untamed male is a symbol of absolute power, and the feminine subject wishes to prove her own power is greater. I mean, if it were about pure submission, any powerful figure, even a stable, dominant CEO, would fulfill the desire. The persistent use of the monstrous, the creature, the supernatural, suggests the power has to be extreme and fundamentally outside of social control, which makes the act of control achieved by the heroine all the more potent.
That argument becomes strained, though, when we look beyond the classic fairy tale structure and examine some of the more explicit content cited in the source material. We have to consider these highly specific, extreme fantasy forms. Examples like Morning Glory Milking Farm are. They're far beyond simple emotional taming. These narratives involve highly deviant or forbidden themes that are centered on the loss of bodily autonomy and engagement with extraordinary external power. These examples, they serve as a psychological litmus test. They demonstrate a clear, uninhibited fascination with scenarios where the self is entirely subject to an external will. This, fundamentally, moves the psychological mechanism squarely into the realm of submission, not emotional conquest. Conquest suggests the woman retains her agency throughout. These extreme fantasies explore the exact opposite. Let's go back to the specific empirical data, because I think it cuts through the ambiguity of narrative structure. When we look at consumption trends, we see that women are statistically more likely to engage with content that is explicitly labeled as violent or domination-based. This is crucial. If the psychological goal were emotional conquest, why wouldn't the preference skew toward narratives focused on manipulative power struggles, or seduction, or mastery through wit? Instead, the preference is for domination, which, in this context, inherently implies a framework centered on being controlled, overpowered, or subjected. The statistical regularity of this preference strongly suggests a repressed, taboo desire for deep submission, an internal need that the appropriate public persona simply cannot recognize or fulfill.
Okay, I understand the gravity of that data point, but we have to be careful about how we define terms within a fantasy context. We're discussing fiction, right? Where boundaries are safe and consequences are absent. Is the appeal truly the desire to be powerless, which is the psychological definition of submission? Or is it that the framework of domination offers the safest possible stage for exploring the uninhibited strength the man possesses? I would argue it's the latter. Domination scenarios are often the most intense displays of raw, unpredictable, absolute power. The fascination is with that untamed, overwhelming force. The woman who engages with that content is perhaps attracted to the intensity of the dynamic, a dramatic framework that allows for the safe management and consumption of the most potent male power available in fiction, rather than a literal desire to lose her own will.
But that still glosses over the fundamental action of the content itself. To explore uninhibited strength, you could just watch action films or read about military prowess. To choose domination-based erotic fiction means the strength must be directed at the protagonist, and the protagonist's response has to involve the temporary or desired failure of their own will. The choice of genre dictates the psychological payoff. The fantasy isn't just about watching strength, it's about being subject to it. If the goal was simply to observe high-intensity power, the structure of the fantasy wouldn't consistently center on the subjugation of the main character. It suggests a comfort, or even a deep-seated need to explore the relief that comes from ceding responsibility and control to an external, powerful force.
That relief, however, that could be the conquest itself. The feminine project, as it's described in the material, is about maintaining societal equilibrium while managing the wildness of male power. So when she's engaging with high-stakes domination content, the woman is testing the absolute limits of power dynamics from a position of narrative safety. The relief you describe might be the cognitive dissonance outlet, the desire to engage with absolute risk, the untamed beast, without any real-world vulnerability. She controls the source material, she controls the book cover, she controls the browser tab. The very act of choosing and engaging with the most powerful possible scenario is an act of agency, even if the content within that scenario is temporary submission.
The very fact that we are forced to discuss this duality, the public versus the private, is evidence of successful repression. Taban is clear. These desires are deeply repressed, and they only emerge in intimate contexts, like fantasy. Social pressure acts as a powerful inhibitor, forcing the concealment of desires that clash with the expectation of female propriety and modern empowerment. I mean, if these desires were simply benign, socially acceptable power fantasies, why would they necessitate specialized, often niche fantasy forms? The depth and the deviance of the preferred fantasy, the attraction to figures that society deems dangerous or monstrous, it reveals the depth of the repression. The need for an extreme outlet proves that the internal desire is extreme and forbidden.
I agree that social pressure forces concealment, but I would argue that fantasy literature and erotic fiction operate primarily as a safe outlet for exploring complex, often conflicting power fantasies, which allows women to navigate this duality. I see this as a healthy management mechanism, not a sign of deep pathological repression. If a desire is truly pathologically repressed, its manifestation would be far more disruptive than choosing a paranormal romance novel. These narratives offer a structured, consequence-free environment to engage with danger and unpredictability, managing the simultaneous desires for agency, the public persona, and fascination with absolute power, the private persona. The fantasy is the controlled environment where those contradictions can coexist without causing conflict in her external life.
But the sheer volume and the explicit nature of the content can't simply be described as managing conflicting desires. The content is seeking a specific psychological result, the experience of being overpowered. If the fantasy were purely about management and navigating conflict, we would see a much wider distribution of content themes. Instead, the focus continually centers on the character's submission to the beast's strength. Repression is what makes this content necessary. It's the forbidden nature of the desire, the societal taboo against admitting a need for powerful relinquishment, that mandates its confinement to the private persona, only to be safely explored when it's disguised as a narrative.
When a woman engages with a powerful, dominating archetype in fantasy, she is conquering fear, she's conquering risk, and she's conquering the limits of her own permissible emotional life. She's exercising control over the parameters of her own uninhibited experience. The beast is a perfect symbolic container for those high stakes. If the attraction were purely submission, the man's power would be sufficient. The fact that the man has to be monstrous suggests the attraction is to the maximum possible threat, thereby maximizing the sense of achievement when that threat is safely consumed or controlled by the reader's engagement.
So, to summarize my perspective, the widespread attraction to the dangerous and the untamable, coupled with the statistically supported preference for domination-based content, it all strongly indicates a powerful, suppressed desire for deep submission.
This psychological need operates independently of public ideals and finds its only outlet in fantasy, confirming that the clash between the public and private persona is fueled by a desire that is fundamentally submission-oriented and taboo. The inner life demands the relinquishment of control that society forbids.
Absolute raw power, and the drive for emotional conquest. The enduring popularity of the monstrous archetype lies in its inherent challenge. In the feminine engagement with this material is an active exercise of agency, taming the beast, conquering fear, and maximizing the power dynamics within a controlled, safe environment.
Well, this rigorous examination certainly illuminates how profound the duality of female personality is. It shows that attraction and desire operate on far more complex psychological levels than simple surface appearance would ever suggest.
Indeed, and understanding the interplay between these powerful, often conflicting archetypes, deep-seated psychology, and rigid social expectations, it requires continued exploration into what we truly mean by power, by agency, and the complex path toward emotional fulfillment.